Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Firewall, the business bytecast, where tech meets business. Get expert insights and real-world business leaders, IT experts, and the latest trends in bite-sized episodes. Stay ahead and explore what's beyond the firewall. And welcome back, everybody, to Beyond the Firewall, where we're always bringing in amazing speakers and leaders in the industry. Today, we have a very special guest, Tom Mawhinney. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Harris. Happy to be on here. And yeah, it's you and I had an opportunity to chat previously, but from the listener's perspective, my background is varied, right? I come from the tech space, which is, I think, how you and I probably connected, intrinsically anyways, and spent a lot of decades in what would be viewed as traditional technology companies, IBM, Digital Equipment, Computer Associates, a lot of work with Microsoft, et cetera, and really use that platform to springboard into ultimately leadership roles across the board. So I've been really, really fortunate that I've been able to sit in the three chairs that I continue to focus on today. So I've sat in the executive chair. I've started a few companies, so that makes me a founder multiple times. And I've actually spent a lot of time in the last 5 or 6 years doing board work. So this will become a recurring theme as you and I chat, is I'm really focused on the topical areas we'll get into in more detail here for those three stakeholders. So it's gone over about 30 years. I've continued to stay focused on technology, but really tying that directly back into strategy and leadership implications across the board, and particularly for those three stakeholders I met before. So you and I have connected at a time where I would never use the word semi-retired, but I've kind of gone in and out of the corporate space, started my own businesses, and now I'm at a point where I'm able to be just a little more selective in terms of where I'm spending my time. And it really comes down to this vector shifting concept, which I'm pretty sure you're going to prompt me on at some point anyways. But I really spent the better part of the last 6-8 months building a lot of thought leadership and IP around that. And I'm sure that'll give us lots to chat about as we move forward.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's interesting seeing, executives and leaders in the space kind of pivoting from being in the trenches and moving into thought leadership roles or coaching and stuff like that. What was the driving passion, if you don't mind, kind of elaborating on this vector shifting thing? Like, what was the passion behind it, and what sparked that kind of thought?
Yeah, so, in the last 10 years, I spent more of my time working with executives on the strategy side. And that's always an area of interest. But what I found over the last, call it 24 to 36 months, is I feel like the majority of the senior leaders, I won't say just in Canada, let's say North America anyways, seem to be rooted in traditional thinking in the way things are moving forward. And I think I can probably get you nodding your head to say, I think technology alone is forcing a different thought process. I would take it one step further and say that the leadership side and the skills required to be an effective leader today are evolving very quickly too. I spent probably the better part of the last 10 years advising executives as an executive, but certainly more often than not from a 2IC perspective in the last 5 years, and just trying to see if we can get them thinking, at least from my perspective, about what the modern climate represents. And I really do think, as cliche as it sounds, when everyone says, well, things are so different now than they once were, again, I think I can get you smiling by saying, I think the last 24 months, maybe 36, certainly from a technology standpoint, have changed the game fundamentally. And I really get passionate about this premise of competitive advantage. Written a number of books on that front too. And I think to build and sustain competitive advantage in today's world, that leaders really have to start looking at the world differently. I think it's in front of them, but I think we all as human beings tend to default to what's worked in the past. So that's really what gets me fired up now, is just having those discussions like this. And more often than not, maybe from an advisory perspective, being a little more specific as to what that can mean in their given organization, right? So where do I think things may be falling down? And they take that input and decide whether or not it's unique enough for their world, specific enough for their world. And, it's been a lot of success. And I say that in a way that's humble, but for the organizations I'm working with, they're seeing immediate returns just by getting that clarity back, Eris, right? It's just that there's so much going on. It's not going to change. If anything, it's going to get more complicated. And you have to get down to the prioritization of things that make the biggest difference in today's climate. So that's what's got me all fired up about doing really what I started out doing many years ago from a founder perspective and working with leaders, but now it's very, very focused on this element of leadership, strategy, and technology working together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I feel that we're in a serious fundamental shift in the way we operate. Everything from efficiencies, productivity. There's so many elements that we're, being hit from so many different angles, global markets, conflicts, new relationships, whatever it may be right now, not just, the buzzword of AI, but we've got so many of those elements that a lot of businesses and business leaders today are struggling to kind of collect all the different variables and make the right sense of it all. And I find that is the big question, is like, what do I focus on? And, one of my big questions for you would be is, so today, with that in mind, what are business leaders today underestimating as one of the biggest challenges?
Yeah, it may come off initially as a bit repetitive, right? In terms of what I was just saying earlier, I really do think where we're underestimating things are just how much has to be prioritized, and you really have to get your head around how many things you need to say no to as a leader, right? Because there's so many choices now when you think about the different paths you can take an organization down, regardless if it's product or service or both. The organizations, and specifically the leaders that I work with, really struggle with the whole, but if we do X, then maybe we can't do Y and Z. And there's a reality there that's probably more definitive now than it ever has been. So the underestimation for me, to sum that up for you, is you do need to be very specific about what you're focused on today more than ever. And I really believe that has to be at what I'll call a macro level rather than a micro level. And if you give me just 30 seconds to explain that, I will do so in the same sentences. My premise is that what has created opportunity, advantage, and ultimately high-performing organizations in the past are what I would refer to as traditional forms of advantage. So it can be your brand, it can be distribution channels, it can be a host of those things that companies have created over the decades and protected forever and as long as they can. I think going back to what you and I both hinted at with technology, especially now, those pathways, those runways are so short now. My belief is you really need to ensure your organization is as strong as it can be in that whole aspect of leadership, strategy, and technology, each one of those variables, and how they operate together. Because if they are out of sync, and that sounds again cliche, but when you think about how many, for instance, technology decisions are being made today for the sake of investing in that technology, as opposed to whether or not that would be a priority for the strategy, the organization, and leadership. Simply stated, it really needs to be brought back to, I think, those three elements if you're going to sustain advantage moving forward, because really those barriers to entry have decreased so significantly now, again, in my opinion, for so many organizations, that to double and triple down on what you've done in the past is really going to put you behind the eight ball.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I'm actually doing a two-stage approach today in our firm, where we have two different sort of mission, vision, goals, and strategies, where we're doing a 1 year out goal, but we're also doing a quarterly goal, because obviously things take time to move the needle. And so we're actually doing two sort of, goals and objectives. And every quarter we've got sort of bite-sized achievements and pivots and implementations and projects like that. And then at the same time, at the end of every quarter, we're also checking how aligned we are to the yearly goal. And if anything's changed in the marketplace that we have to pivot to realign, maybe, like we're not talking about completely overhauling the goal, but, do we need to move the needle a little bit to the left or to the right for the next quarter, so that we're doing that two-prong kind of, optics, from a, day-to-day kind of project-based type of implementations to what the long-term objectives are. And it is very challenging with all of those variables, and when we look at that, another sort of question there is, so, what's separating organizations today that are thriving with the current environment? Like, what do you see as a major success for a lot of these businesses?
Yeah, it's similar along the lines of what you just said. So plug for you and the approach you just outlined, right? I think if the organization is willing to invest the time in earnest to more frequently reflect on whether or not everything is aligned. That, in my opinion, that's probably the most important word in organizational strategy today. I come from a backdrop, yes, doing the mission and the values and the objectives and all those things, they're still important, but they really have to be far more dynamic, much like you were just describing, right? You have to set out targets if you're a for-profit business, absolutely, and that doesn't change. But you do need to maintain a nimble enough organization and leadership structure to be able to review and pivot. And when I say pivot, I'm coming back to, again, some of your words. I'm not saying 180-degree shift, but if you're not able and the organization's not set up to be able to actually pivot when that's required, it creates challenges, because what was an advantage for even your organization 6 months ago may not be next quarter. Maybe, but it may not be. And if you guys are looking at that continually saying, hey, this is where we think things are going, perhaps we should kind of tweak this and tune that from a strategic standpoint, I'm going to assume that in your organization, you probably have technology first as you're thinking about things. Most organizations still today do not. They are embracing generative AI, of course, and they're using that to gain some efficiencies. I think there's a lot of steps they can and probably should be taking to use that to their benefit and create an organization that performs significantly better than they are currently on the vector for. And there, a little plug to the vector shifting reference is the whole idea is I think most organizations, if they take half a step back, can really shift the trajectory of their organization. And I don't think that's overly complicated if they're willing to invest the time and effort. And I don't think we're not talking months and years here, but really looking at things the way they have evolved and being willing to continue to look at them that way. Again, back to that whole look at your leadership structure. Is it aligned with your strategy? That sounds cliche, maybe not as much as people think. And then technology, which in my opinion, again, I don't think I'm getting an argument from you, has gone from being a support element of business to one of those three key pillars. And if you're thinking about those in alignment, I think you're more often than not going to be in a great place to perform, meet and preferably exceed expectations. And that's the trajectory that I work with executives on, is not just trying to be an also ran, really trying to get to that point where it isn't always necessarily being number one, but exceeding the expectations, hopefully lofty expectations that you set out for your organization.
Yeah, interesting perspective. And you're working with organizations and leaders, they're going through a bit of a transition on conventional business and the way things were working during the pandemic, pre-pandemic. Like this is sort of like a new animal, the way I'm saying it, because we're turning a page today. What are you seeing today as habits and decision-making processes that are driving better outcomes that you're sort of working with these leaders? Like how are you helping them evolve those habits today?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it segues nicely into I do a lot of thought leadership stuff on LinkedIn, et cetera. And really what I've narrowed down and focused on for the better part of the last month happens to be three decisions that I think if organizations started to revisit that traditional thinking would open up that whole promise to be more nimble and flexible with the things I was talking about before. I'll give you an example. Well, one of those is definitely travel. So, and this goes, I'm pulling that right from the example you used, post-pandemic, right? Everybody traveled, pandemic hit, nobody traveled. Of course, the pendulum is swinging back heavy the other way again. We have the ability to do so. Culture demands everyone's face-to-face. I could make a very good argument with data behind me that would suggest we've pushed that a little too far, where I think, especially executives, and I'm one of them, so I let myself into this, always feel that their presence in the room makes all the difference in the world all the time. It does matter. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that shouldn't happen. But it's a default tendency for organizations to just let travel, and I'm talking even in many cases international and very expensive travel, the fourth most prominent expense line on most organizations' balance sheet and income statement, is that travel element defaulting just saying travel and go. It slows things down. You probably have lots of experience with this as you're trying to coordinate a bunch of schedules for people to be in room. My argument, which really isn't meant to be that covert, is the technology has advanced, like what we're using here today, not just video calling, but I think everything has advanced to the point where 90%, and I'm using that number, making that up on the spot, 90% of where people are traveling to today could be accomplished faster, more efficiently, and equally as effectively without just jumping on a plane and going to do it. Leaving that 10% open, again, I agree with the cultural aspect of it. I just think we've defaulted so far past. And that is an example of that traditional thinking that I'm referring to, Harris, is that we default back when things are normal. We default back into the decisions we've made in the past. So another one of those decisions, and I'd be interested to get your take on this as well, is the whole idea of, especially when it comes to senior leadership roles in organizations, fractional versus full-time. Now, I'm not at any point making the argument that a CEO doesn't have to be full-time and steering the bus the entire time. But I can make a pretty good argument that from a CFO, sometimes even a CIO, certainly a CSO, Chief Strategy Officer, really I find, at least in the organizations I've worked in, and it's been quite a few, those roles come in and out of absolute necessity, and they're not constantly in need to set. That's my opinion. And I would say it's backed by, again, a bunch of research and personal experience. And you're seeing more senior leaders like myself, but probably many others that you've had even on your podcast, look at things fractionally, right? If they can come in and help, and not just one and done, but be able to engage in that organization, provide the value they bring to the table when it's needed most, but not forcing that organization that has hired them to A, go find them in the first place, B, pay them what is a pretty significant investment when you're talking that level of senior leadership role, and everything else that goes with that, and being able to leverage them from a continuity perspective, but not necessarily having to incur the cost associated, and very significant cost as the organization gets bigger, with having everyone be full-time all the time. So that's, again, it's not me saying flat out every organization should think fractionally. It's back to this whole idea is, have you reassessed the way you've defaulted in the past? More often than not, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the organizations I worked in, it's, you go to your executive placement or recruiter and you're saying, we need the CFO, go find one. It takes months. Few stubbing your toe moments. It's very expensive to do that, especially when you have to start over. There is all kinds of very significant talent out there that would happily put in the time and effort and bring the expertise to the table for those organizations. They may be working with one or two others. You got to watch the competitive side. But I just think there's more flexibility there that provides all kinds of benefits if organizations rethink through that decision. Maybe not right for them, but it is worth revisiting. And I know it's a little long-winded. I'll get to the third one here, and it's not going to surprise you. It's the AI side. And I have, and I know I mentioned to you in a previous conversation, I've stayed as best I can really at the forefront of emerging tech from an education standpoint, because I love it. I've always been involved in, but I also think it has such a monumental impact today, never mind what that's going to be like tomorrow. What I refer to from an AI perspective is not just investing in AI tools and finding the cursory efficiencies that come with that. Dashboards, writing manuals, writing reports, whatever it is. I'm talking about at least thinking about, can some of, if not most of the roles in your organizations be redefined to leverage those technologies to a greater extent? And that all gets back to that debate. Do I really want, as the CEO, more AI in my organization, ethically or otherwise? I get it. But there's no doubt in my mind, I will not mention organizations specifically I've worked with in the past, but certainly watching them feel like they are at the front end of the cycle because they were using ChatGPT 2 months before most organizations. That's not what I'm referring to here. I think you and I both know that there's ways of looking at, especially in the more junior roles in organizations that are probably getting hit the hardest by things that can be done from an automated perspective now. In my opinion, there's ways to redefine those roles, which edge the human decision-making as far more important if you're having the ability to go back and look at role descriptions and just how things exist in the organization. Again, sounds trivial. I think you probably have firsthand experience saying that's not that easy to do. But from an advantage standpoint, those that embrace the possibility, I think, are already heads and tails above many of the other organizations, and they'll continue down that path, is my guess. So again, those three decisions, I'm not suggesting the rocket science or it's the first time anyone's heard them, but I am suggesting taken together, you look at the way people have defaulted, AI being a little more recent than calling it traditional thinking, but just start thinking about how we need to even structure our organization or restructure, not all in one day, But looking at how do you get the most out of AI, and not far behind it, robotics and those things specific to product companies, you really need to start thinking about that rather than just trying to force fit it back end. Like retrofitting, in my opinion, is going to make you also ran at best. So I think organizations and particularly the leaders need to start thinking about whether or not there's an applicability to that in their organization. I know that was a lot, and my apologies, but you asked me a question. What do I think is being what are the decisions that I think people are maybe not reconsidering, or I'm not going to say making incorrectly because that's very subjective, but
Yeah.
I would make a pretty good argument, Aras, that with the executives that I've worked with, particularly over the last 8 months, of those 3 decision points, more often than not, you'll find those executives leaving and at least going deep into reconsidering 2 of them. Doesn't mean they come out the other end saying, hey, we ended up doing exactly what that guy said. But they're starting to think, and they will read this back to me, as an organization, we're starting to think about, is the modern climate dictating that we start thinking about the way our business is organized and how we go to market? Do we need to think about that differently? And my argument is clearly yes.
Yeah, I'll fully agree with you on that. So, like, last 2 years, when it comes to travel and conferences and trade shows and stuff, like, we were just so starving for that in-person experience that we were attending everything and anything possible, traveling. And, I think last year there was, I think, a 3-month window that I think I saw my kids like on the weekends because I was traveling all over the United States. And I was even considering on even traveling to Europe just to see what was going on that side of the world. And it took a lot of time, took a lot of effort, definitely not cheap for companies to do that. And we actually expanded that throughout our teams. And we're now pulling back on that, and definitely we're being a little bit more selective, and we're trying to see what value the event's going to have versus just attending another event. So I agree with you on some of that as an example. And then for the other element around the fractional services, I think two elements are happening there as we speak, and you touched on it with your third item. So the way I see it right now with the current climate, number one, we started offering fractional CIO services. So that 5 years ago was almost non-existent. Now we're actually seeing a massive amount of that where companies don't need a CIO in their business, law firms, accounting firms, but once a year, they may need somebody to align their IT strategy. And so typically it was the controller or the finance person that was in charge of IT. We're seeing now that it's beyond their depth, especially once we've talked into cybersecurity and into AI. They're needing that third party advice. Nobody's going to hire somebody like that on a 6-digit figure payroll for something that you can pull in for 30, 60, 90 days for a strategy session.
Exactly.
And align the company correctly. And we've been parachuting people in. And then to go with that third thought process there, AI is also helping enable it so that we're sort of layering it in. So we're helping companies now not only use AI, but we're putting the input so that the framework is there with our methodology. The company now is able to use that reference tool with the AI model. And then if we need to parachute back in, they're able to leverage both tools as thought leaders, both within the AI framework and with the company who's got industry experience. And now we're talking about a whole new solution that didn't exist 24 to 36 months ago. It's a whole new animal. And I find that that's across the board. Like we're looking at right now, fractional CFO. And I just told another client of mine, fairly large company, they're north of 20 million, almost $30 million in revenue. And they're like, oh, I need a new HR manager or director of HR. I'm like, why? I'm like, go to an HR agency. They do fractional HR services and they'll do everything. It's not like you need to have somebody in there. And they're like, I never even thought about that. And, they're going to parachute in, do the interviews, do the policies, be available when you need it. And it's at a fraction of the cost. So I think companies, especially mid-sized market companies, I think a lot of people need to open their eyes and realize that there are more options today than there ever was. And what I'm also finding is a lot more experienced, even enterprise level executives are looking for these, call it two-prong kind of contracts where, ex-IBMer is now going to be coming in as a CIO or CTO, and they can go in and work at 30 different businesses on a part-time basis, and they are enjoying it more than just sitting there working at some Fortune 500 company doing the same thing day in, day out. So yeah, I'm fully in agreements to that one. But my next question for you is, talking about AI, and I want to kind of pivot to that is, AI is the noise. And that's one of my biggest challenges is everybody asks me being in IT is what do you see AI create? Where do you see AI creating value versus?
Yeah, and this one I've already hinted at as well, right? I mean, again, apologies for the redundancies, but my view on this, I'm past, and I'm sure most people listening are past having a debate of is AI just this monolith or is it a set of tools? And I default to the latter, and it is a set of tools. Now, I think it can have far reaching ramifications if you're willing to look at how you best lever those tools in the organization that you have created. And that goes back to, are we willing to look at the way we go to market, build our products, deliver our services differently, and start leveraging some of the capability of this AI tool set that exists out there? And I was, again, already talking to one of these when it's one thing to start using generative AI behind everything that you do, but that could probably be even more significant in terms of its impact on the business, still leaving in human judgment before anything ever got near a client. I'm very quick to suggest that nothing should go unfettered. But I really do think the definition of the way work is done, I'm not suggesting everything has changed, because I think you and I both agree things are just going to keep changing and evolving and evolving and evolving. But I think there's already a big gap between people viewing AI purely as AI tools and noise, using your words to it, and the ability to actually think about redefining their business to get a leg up or an advantage, which I always come back to saying it is really hard to, let's say you're a product business, to build the best product nowadays and sustain that for very long, right? Because there's so many competitors out there in this market with the ability, by leveraging technology, to whatever gap you had in function, if we want to say that, can be closed pretty quick. So you need to be thinking about, how is this going to continue to allow us to take time and cycles away from work that can be done very well by machines or AI, and put that into the, we'll call it for argument's sake, the value added piece that is probably going to create the greater differentiation for your organization than anything else will, right? So that's, never have I said and never will I say that AI is overblown. I actually almost argue the other side is just saying, I do think that we're past a point where it's not a fad, it's not a trend. I think 99% of people listening are going, we get it, it's here, we use it. My point is, it becomes less about noise and the next great thing when you start embedding the thought process around what should be automated in our business that hasn't been in the past, and how can we better use the human resources. And yes, you and I could then, if we wanted to, spin off and start talking about all these organizations that are dropping 33% of their workforce. Efficiencies were always going to be there. I think my argument would be, do those numbers need to be that high, or have they gone through the work to suggest that we've redefined how jobs are done? Now we can just get more of our product or service out to the marketplace because we've automated a lot of that, call it introductory work, and put those people, retrain them to some extent, into value add position where we grow. That's always, it seems, with most executives, growth comes up all the time, right? And we want to grow. It's pretty tough when all of a sudden the first thing you're announcing is the CEO that you're putting a 20 or 25% workforce reduction in place. One, it doesn't inspire a lot of workers to head toward your organization. Yeah. And two, obviously you're taking a step back, usually from a revenue standpoint, in exchange for cost efficiencies. And I understand why organizations do that in the short run. Yeah. But my argument is, there has to be a retraining, a rethinking of the workforce. And if you ever ask me a question, and maybe you will today, what keeps me up at night? I have 3 boys, all in that age group, who are out there trying to figure out, hey, Dad, these jobs you talked about back in the past that you did, those things don't exist anymore. And my point would be, organizations and countries, for that matter, had better get their head around this retraining and what roles look like going forward, because just throwing or having your kid go into university and enroll in the things that you and I used to do is going to be very difficult as an entry-level employee coming into the workforce. Almost, I'm not going to quite say impossible, but just for fun in this interview, get some shock value, I would say it's going to be extremely difficult. And that's something that I think about all the time. And for what I can do to aid to that, trying to help organizations, albeit one organization at a time to some extent, start thinking about redefining where humans provide that value in their world, right? I mean, not for everybody, but for their organization.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you just made about, kids coming out of school and entry level jobs. Like when we look at it right now, we were just having this conversation, like AI is going to replace a lot of the, call it level 1, level 2 help desk stuff, so resetting passwords, resetting this, creating users, why my printer is not working. And AI is going to eventually take that over. And that's typically been sort of like I call it a student role, like we worked with community colleges, universities, trade schools, and we would bring these students in with very little experience, and we would give them that opportunity to work on the bench, be able to get there, and then eventually kind of groom them and train them up. And there is not going to be any more of this. From our perspective, it's going to be like, well, why am I going to hire somebody when I got an AI assistant already doing that? But yet I'm going to need people in level 2, level 3, level 4, and beyond. No different than bookkeeping. Like, accountants will not need to be doing data entry on general ledger stuff and putting in information, because that's going to be done by an automation process, but you still needed an accountant. So how do you go from being an articling student or, somebody learning how to become an accountant, but yet go straight to accounting without ever going through that hurdle because AI is already eating that job up? So it's going to be a really interesting question on how we get students go from A to Z without actually going through the alphabet.
Exactly. It's the old cliche, right? You can't get experience without a job, can't get a job without experience. It's a dilemma, I think.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it there so you and I don't go off on a completely different path with this conversation.
Yeah.
It's a fun one and it's a scary one, right? And when you live in it, and it's funny you mentioned accounting. My wife's a CFO. 8 months ago was saying to me, well, that's kind of cute, that AI thing, and I can see how it writes some reports and M&A things a little faster, but I'm going to need my team forevermore. There's no way a tool is doing that. And now there's, wow.
Yeah.
The whole entry-level hiring process that she and her senior team have had is very quickly going by the wayside for all the reasons you just mentioned, right? And that's trouble, because the last time I checked, it's a growing population, and you can't suggest to everyone that office-oriented jobs are completely going away, even though there is an element of risk if we don't start reframing where the human value is going to be.
Yeah, no, 100%. You kind of brought up a conversation before around, your son saying, or your kids were saying, like, these jobs are no longer relevant. And I've said this before on a previous interview, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, definitely there was no SEO, social media manager job. There was no, social influencers didn't exist 25. A lot of these jobs were created as part of a new industry, as part of a new service, as part of the evolution of technology. So, conventional print business may have faded away and other businesses have percolated. We as a society have always created new innovations and new technologies. And even if we don't look at technology, look at the experience of vacations and cruises, luxury other items that we've evolved into. And so I don't think it's doom and gloom. I think it's really about defining, as you mentioned before, defining what that is. And so like one of my next questions would be is, for business owners today, how are you helping them stay ahead of all of this versus reacting? Because I think this is a big challenge today for business owners and executives across the board is, how do I stay ahead versus reacting to what's happening?
Yeah. And those are great terms. And I hear it all the time. When I do get an executive reaching out, they almost always describe it as, I feel like we're just reacting to stuff that's going on all over the place. But and I'm sure you hear it all the time too, just being in the tech space to the extent that you are. So, again, sorry if some of this stuff sounds like I've said it before, but, my initial conversation with them, if they've already acknowledged that they or their leadership team is reacting, it's, can we agree we want to get you to start being proactive? A little cliche term there. Yeah. But I do do think it comes down to you. It can't be see a bear, shoot a bear. Like everything that's out there, you can't say we need it, we got to have that, or we're behind. Again, I come back to, and as simplistic as I'm trying to make this sound, even though it's not overly simple, is you got to get back to, I don't want to say fundamentals, but I think if you're focused on making sure you have excellence in your leadership team, the strategy you set out that differentiates the organization, at least today, in the market, and you're leveraging technology and aligning it with your decisions, your prioritization becomes a little more clear. And that's when they get away from the reacting, because they say, I started this part of the conversation with you almost 40 minutes ago, making this comment that I find that executives struggle most with the things they're not going to do versus things they are going to do. And this is back to the reacting piece. I think, and I usually tell them in the opening 10 minutes, is what you'll find in terms of our conversations is that I'm going to be challenging you when you say, here's our strategic plan, here are the things we're rolling out, and then we visit again in 3 months and you've added 8 more things. It'll be one of 2 things. Did those 8 new things align specifically with what you had set out to do? And by the way, because you have finite resources like everyone else, what fell off when you brought those 8 things in? That to me is what helps leaders and has helped me in the past running my organizations. Is you still have to focus on the things that make the biggest impact, the 80-20 rule, call it whatever you want, the things that are going to help you most getting to where you want to go, and stop reacting to everything that's out there, because it's only going to get worse, if you want to use that term. There are more things coming. You and I aren't getting into robotics and some of those other things today. I know how deep you can go in cybersecurity and all these other elements that are much bigger strategically than they once were or ever were. And you need to start thinking that way. Again, flexible enough to pivot as pivots required, but don't just add things. And that is interesting. That sounds really simple. And you're kind of looking at it going, boy, that sounds like something everyone would say. Every executive, after 20 minutes chatting with them, that's the one thing they read back to me they took away, is I have to stop. We have to stop trying to do everything. And most organizations can rationalize really well. I'm pretty good as an individual rationalizing purchase decisions. We needed to do that, Tom, because this. And it sounds right when they say it in isolation. But at what opportunity cost errors, right? And that becomes down to what are the things that are going to drive your business to success. I'd like to think we're all in business to be successful, or the organization to be successful, and focus on those. So that's the long-winded answer, saying you can call it focus, focus, focus if you want, but be prepared to say no and make those kind of decisions that are in the best interest of your organization and all the stakeholders involved.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you on that one. I remember going through a couple different sort of executive programs in my career, and it's always about keeping focused. As an entrepreneur myself, it's every shiny new thing. I feel like I'm a squirrel, like, and there's a laser pointer, and it's just my eyes just kind of get excited about every shiny new thing. And, it is a challenge. I'm not going to lie. And I will say that having a coach or a mentor or, an advisor, I find has been really key and focused for us, because, that accountability person to help, you look at Tiger Woods, you look at any other successful person out there, in the background, most people don't realize there is a coach, there is a mentor, there is somebody to help them stay focused on their game. And that could be sports, that could be, executives. They all have somebody to help them stay focused on what's key and critical, and having it written down and having that, you kind of say, I may have repeated myself. The reality is that's how we learn, is repetition, repetition, repetition. Mm-hmm. So if you do it once, you'll never remember it. You do it 5 times, you'll remember how to do it. Those things are key, and I think when we want to become successful as executives, as entrepreneurs, you're not going to do that once and be done. It's about being consistent, being disciplined. And when you get off the rails, you have somebody to be sort of like your safety net, or somebody to kind of, just kind of push you back into the right lane and saying, hey, getting distracted. Now let's get back on track so that we can achieve our goals. And I think that, the things that you mentioned are essential for executives out there and business owners to be successful. And this is, 100% of any successful playbook out there. So, when I look at it, we're in an interesting world today. There's so much going on. in all aspects of it. And there's a lot of good things that are happening. So this is not all negative. There's a lot of good things. But when you walk into a business tomorrow, okay, or a new client tomorrow, what are the three sort of pillars or things do you sort of look at as an initial evaluation to sort of give people?
Yeah, and I think I've cheated on this one just because that which I talk about in terms of competitive advantage in the modern climate is, to me, about three variables. It's about leadership, strategy, and technology. So, to translate into what you said, when I get engaged, it is with very specific questions and inquiries in mind to see two things related to those, right? And it's, do you have, it's a bit subjective, but do you have excellence within those three things of leadership, strategy, and technology to the extent that you can? No one can do everything perfectly. And probably more importantly, is there synchronization across them? So, for instance, I will do some work and have done some work recently with some PE firms. They do their diligence. They're very good at what they do. They can project and they've been doing it for years. My value proposition to them is that I can work with them, go in for 2 to 3, maybe 4 days, depending on the size of the organization, do exactly what I was just articulating to you. Look at how these three things are performing and how they are working together and provide that assessment, because the PE folks care about, is the projection and the model that we've created going to hold up? Or is this something that's going to fall apart over time because we just assumed everything was working well together? And that is an important assessment for them, because at the end of the day, the valuation piece is key. But it's all about the lens, right? And straying a little bit away from your question, because I think I've given you the very specifics of what I do think it matters a lot. And this is not meant to be a knock at consultants in general, because I am one, I guess, if you want to frame it that way. I do think you need to have walked a mile in the shoes before you're going to be able to at least think about what that individual or set of individuals is going through and thinking about at the time. Boards, for instance. Board members think about their governance responsibilities a fair bit differently than the executives that, to some extent, they govern. Executives have the immediacy required in making quarterly numbers or whatever it is that's set up there. And then founders, total different kettle of fish, because while you're flying out there with your new product or service and trying to make some headway, you're also responsible for building an organization from scratch. And my conversations there around, here's the time where you can think about doing this without having to go back and retrofit when it's more painful. My point being that the approach to leadership, strategy, and technology, as long as you have the lens and maybe some exposure experience with that lens, you're able to provide this coaching you referred to. I like to call it advisory work, because only in my mind, the difference is you're not just saying, hey, think about this, and you're leaving. The advisory is, hey, let's think about this, and here's what you could specifically consider doing as alternatives, and actually go execute, again, back from experience or having sat in that chair. My argument would be, if you haven't sat in the chair, and I do see lots of folks out there, and call it the consulting world, that are saying, hey, I'm going to come in and help you with this. They haven't had that exposure to the way things were or are today even. And it's pretty tough for you to go in and saying, well, just do this. If you haven't, saying, hey, here's some things that are tried and true. Here's some things that trial and error have proven do not work. And then hopefully some things that with some view into what's coming down the pipe, not just from a technology standpoint, but even the way leadership needs to be thought of today. And sorry, I don't want to digress too far here, but I feel like I've kind of robbed a little bit of the conversation from this whole idea of evolution of the modern business climate. I feel that the leadership skills themselves. So you asked me, what do I say when I go into leaders? There's a quiet check into whether or not those skills that they're bringing to the table are where they need to be to make sure that that's reflected through the entire organization. And one big thing, and we don't have time for it today, when you think about the shifting expectations and perceptions of employees, call it the younger generation, and their view, they're expecting far better personal skills than you'll get from most leaders today, because they've always been focused on their professional skills. And then they're also expecting a lot more of an appreciation for technology, as opposed to a CEO 5 years ago, Aris maybe could say, I've got good people that do that. That's true, but you have to be articulate enough in it if you're going to be the he or she that is the talking head for the organization and attracting this younger generation into your company. That expectation's there. So all of these three things is my point of leadership, strategy, and technology. They need to evolve with what's already happening, not what's going to happen. And that is, in a nutshell, the way I start conversations with execs. The most important thing, though, is I would never get away from the fact that the application of this has to be unique to the organization and their unique circumstances. I believe in that completely, that every organization is a little different. There are principles and premises that you can go down the path, but you have to have enough of an appreciation for what that organization is going through, where they sit, where they may be trying to go, before you can say one size fits all.
Right. Yeah, I fully agree with you on that one. It's an interesting animal, having those three pillars and trying to have a good balance. I think that in most cases, most leaders have, a strong point, and having that balance is a hard thing to find and even learn or adopt. And so, yeah, having that skill set and learning that and getting into it and evolving that toolbox is something that every executive needs to constantly evolve, and, being part of an ecosystem, or, having somebody to reference, I think is key and critical in that respect. So kind of stepping back, I know that you kind of mentioned this, but I'll kind of reword it a little bit as a question here. So we talked about the three pillars there. What's a hard truth for business owners and executives to hear right now that they may not want to hear today?
Summed up, I would say this, Eris. I would say what has worked for you in the past, I guarantee you will not work for you going forward. That will get attention. Yes, it's done for dramatic effect, but it's true. It's accurate in my opinion. So they don't want to hear that because they have elevated to their chair. Their organization has likely been successful to date because of the things they've historically done. All made sense in that time. I come back to, I believe firmly that the world has changed so much in this last 24 to 36 months. You cannot bring that playbook forward in its entirety. You have to start revising it, evolving it, use the word you want, to match what is actually already transpiring, not just technology, but that's a big part of it. Hopefully through this conversation that's come out, and really start to, hey, I know you have short-term responsibilities in terms of financials, and I'm not suggesting you take your eye off that ball, but the medium long-term sustainability is going to require a different approach. And hopefully, and usually I've found so far, most of those leaders want to go down that path. I mean, you could probably argue, if you're talking to someone who's getting close to retirement, they're going, I just want to accomplish what I've set out to accomplish and I'm done. This is someone else's problem. I tend to gravitate toward those that are saying they're going to be in that environment or sitting in that chair for a period of time where they're looking at that going, hey, I can try to throw everything at it to look good this year and next, but I really want to look good for the next 5-10 years if shelf life allows for that. But that is the thinking. And that's generally speaking what I hope for most organizations, that there's enough people in the leadership environment that are acknowledging that they have to start thinking a little differently than they have in the past. I actually just had a little smile. My first time I realized my first career was with IBM. Their biggest marketing slogan back in the day was think differently.
Yes.
Didn't even make that connection.
Yes. Well, yeah, you had to back then.
It is, it's interesting, right? When I'm fortunate enough now where, there's a fair bit of momentum and referral type business. So it's less about going and trying to get shock value by saying things like you just asked me, hey, you guys won't be around next year if you continue to do this. I don't say things like that, but I will go as far as saying what I just said. If you're going to continue to execute in the same playbook, your organization will not be performing anywhere near where it should be.
100%. So as a final question, and you kind of almost asked yourself this question about 20 minutes ago, and this will be our last question. What's keeping you up right now professionally?
Yeah, when you add the word professionally, it changes a little. If you said personally, I already answered that. And that is, where are my kids, your kids, other kids? Where are they going to find jobs that aren't all kind of going back to using their hands? And sure, that robotics going to. Professionally, it is really an extension of what I've been saying is, I feel like there is a lot of leaders out there that are saying, I get it, that's important, I should think about it, but I don't have time. And it really is, how do I help them understand that there is no bigger priority, at least in parallel, to making sure their organization will be successful moving forward, no matter what chair they're in of the three that I talked about, then starting to rethink how that organization might go to market, for lack of a better phrase, right? So it may surprise you when you work as long as I have. I'm not going to say as long as you have, but I'll date myself first. you see people get comfortable, and it's really hard to pull them out of that when they've been rewarded, awarded, recognized as being very good at what they do, because they are good at what they do. My argument is, hey, you came into this when you were climbing up the ladder to get in your leadership position. You strived and you learn new things. Do not stop. And this is one of those things, without just saying, hey, go to a course. It's why don't we apply it to your business? So, we all evolve a little bit as we go. Your business comes along for the ride. And in most cases, and I would argue in almost all of them, you're going to have an organization that's performing beyond the average and preferably into the area of excellence, which is what we're all striving for.
Wow. That is an amazing hour. Honestly, Tom, this was incredible. One of the best conversations I've had in a while. I want to thank you for being on our podcast today.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you were an amazing guest. Honestly, it was a lot of fun. Great conversation. I want to thank everybody out there for being on our podcast, listening, and hopefully you guys like and subscribe. Again, I want to thank you, Tom, for being on our podcast today. Hopefully we'll get you back on another conversation. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll catch you at the next episode.
Thanks, Harris.